Welcome back to this week's speaker's tip. This week, I'm going to talk about speaking without notes. And again, this is a subject that I've had a number of people send me emails on. They said they'd like some assistance in learning how to speak without notes. There's a number of points on this. I want to make this as simple as I can. What a lot of people do is they will take a piece of paper and they'll type or they'll write their speech on the paper. And the speech is on the paper. It's not here. It's not here. It's been written on the paper. So in order to know what to say, they have to read the paper. They have to read the notes. And the whole idea of being able to speak in public is to basically know what you're going to say in here. You know your subject matter. It's not on the paper. We use the paper, as I said, to sort it out, to organize it. Now I know that. Okay, now that's nice up front. I'm going to go through a little system I use on how to speak without notes, but I want to give you a little bit of an analogy beforehand. And I did this in an earlier speaking tip when I talked about the difference between knowing your speech and memorizing your speech. So what a lot of people will do is they'll write their speech on the paper, and then they'll try to memorize the sequence of words that they put on the paper. So in their mind now, they're trying to take this and they're trying to put this speech in their mind with a specific sequence of words. When we memorize something, we basically commit it to memory on exactly how it goes. And the example of this, if you ever, as a kid, memorized a poem, and you know what would happen if you were memorizing a poem and you messed up? You had to start over and start the poem over again because you said a word out of sequence. Now that's memorizing. Now let's look at this as that these are instructions to drive someplace. You can read the instructions and go down the street, turn right, go 2 blocks, turn left, and you can read the instructions. And the only way you know how to get there is by reading the instructions on the piece of paper. But after you've driven it a few times, after a while, you start to know where to go. You understand how the streets lay out. You don't need to read the instructions to know where you're going. And that's the difference between memorizing a speech and knowing your speech. Once you actually know the speech, you don't need to remember every word to know what the story is, to know the sequence that you're going through. A lot of examples I can give to you, but what I've seen, and also it's amazing, a lot of the coaching that I've done with people, they are great at writing their speech, but they write it as though it's a letter. They don't write it as though they're saying it. And there's a difference between a written word and a spoken word. It's a whole other subject. Okay, let's get this. How do you get off the notes? Well, the simplicity is instead of trying to remember every word in sequence, which is what your notes are, let's remember sections of the speech and know what sections they go through. I'm going to share my screen, a little PowerPoint on speaking without notes here. Now, a basic speech format, let's look at this. A speech format is you have an opening statement. That's the first thing you want to know. What's my opening statement? In most speeches, and especially in the Toastmasters environment, but in most speeches in general, you'll have 3 different points you make. It could be 3 different stories, a sequence that's coming through, but your speech is normally broken down into about 3 steps, unless you're doing like an hour keynote. But for most people, you're going to have somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes to speak. And you normally can break it down in about 3 steps we need to go. Here's what happens. You go more than that, you start to confuse the audience. So let's keep it simple. For this example, we're going to say you have 3 points. Now, the question is, can you remember the 3 points, the 3 stories? All you have to do now is know your opening. You have to remember 3 stories or 3 points you're going to make, and then you're going to talk about each of those points. Once you remember the point, you know what you're going to say. Oh, yeah, point number 1. I'm going to give you an example of this in just a second. And then you have a conclusion or a closing statement to your speech. So the big thing is you need to really have your opening nailed. You need to know what you're opening with your speech. You don't want to walk up and go, oh, well, I'm glad I'm here. There's a lot of things I want to talk to you about today. And, I really want to talk about this subject. That's not an opening. An opening is, boom, we know how to open the speech. I'm going to give you an example of this. Same thing with conclusion. A lot of people don't know their conclusion, so they wind up talking longer and longer and longer, trying to figure out how to get out of the speech. You need to know your conclusion, how I'm ending the speech. Boom, you go into that, you end the speech. Then your 3 points. That's a pretty simple way to go about it. But you have to realize the only thing you're memorizing, the only thing you're committing to memory is your opening, your conclusion, and the 3 points in between. Now let's take this a little bit further. So you have point number 1. Let's keep it simple. Point number 1 consists of 3 subpoints. So you get to point number 1 and you have 3 subpoints in it. Okay. Then you go to point number 2 and you have 3 subpoints in point number 2. So I'm going to talk about point number 2 and I'm going to have 3 little things I'm going to talk about. I can remember 3s. Triads are a very, very powerful rhetorical device to use in your speaking. The triad sets up a pattern, but it also doesn't overwhelm the audience with information or examples. It's also easy for us as speakers to remember. I can remember 3. Give me 4, it gets a little difficult. Give me 5, forget about it. Okay, so then we come to point number 3, and I have 3 points on point number 3. And then I have a conclusion and close my speech. So really all I had to remember was my opening. As I said, point number 1, point number 2, point number 3. And when I got to point number 1, I went, oh yeah, there's 3 things I want to talk about that. Here's what they are. Here's where they go. And you just talk about them. You don't have to read them. You just talk about them. I know what to say. Okay. Now let's give an example. I'm going to give a talk, and my talk is about what I like about vacations. Pick any subject you want. So I have an opening, and the opening goes like this. One of my favorite things to do in life is to plan and go on a vacation. I'm not the type of person who runs off to Las Vegas for a vacation. There are 3 specific actions I want to accomplish with my vacation. I just set up my speech for you. 3 specific actions. What are those? The first point is I want to see someplace new. So as an example, I've gone on vacations. Okay, excuse me. I got ahead of myself. The first point is I want to see something new. The second point is I want to learn something new. And the third thing is I want to meet some new people. That's what I'm looking for in a vacation. Now I just set up the basic flow of the speech. Typically, I would take each point one at a time and expand on it. The first point is I want to see someplace new. So let's look at this. So point number 1, first point is I want to see someplace new. Back in 2005, I took off and I did a camping trip in Yosemite, and I talked about Yosemite and how I drove up there and I saw El Capitan, I saw the waterfalls, and I saw the Sierra Pine, how incredible it was, and I had deer eating out of my hand. I can come up with a couple points in Yosemite. I did another trip to New Orleans, and we went to Bourbon Street and went to jazz festivals, and I rode the streetcars around New Orleans, and I went down and what are they? They're not baguettes. There's a baguette. I got a baguette at the place down there in the park, where they cook these pastries up. And you talk about New Orleans. And then I went to Lake Superior and the icy Great Lakes and the sandy beaches that they had. And I toured the iron ore mines in Duluth, Minnesota, right at the end of Lake Superior, where we went down, a mile underground, and it was all solid because of the iron ore. And you talk about those 3 things. Very easy to remember. I saw a new place. Point number 2, I wanted to learn something new. So Yosemite, I learned about how it became a national park, and we toured the museum there, whatever. New Orleans, I took a gray line tour around the city, or I walked down into the pumping stations on how they pump the area out that's under sea level. Or I walked around and saw how the dike system worked or something. You talk about how you learn something new. And then I went to Lake Superior and I learned how the lakes were used in the settlement of the US and how because of the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway, were able to bring ships all the way into the center of the United States, because the ocean going ships can now go through through the Great Lakes all the way to Duluth, Minnesota, and drop their goods off and pick up corn and farm goods and take them around the world. So we talk about something new that we learned there. And the last one is we want to meet new people. I talk about the people that I met when I was camping in Yosemite and the friends I have. I talk about the people I met in New Orleans, that I was at a jazz bar and I met people with jazz, and we love jazz. We change business cards, and we now send Christmas cards to each other every year. I talk about Lake Superior and when I was camping there, or, you know, that I went on a ferry ride out, was it? I can't remember the name of the island right now. It's on the north side of Lake Superior there, Grand something. Anyway, beautiful island, natural park. Went out there and I met all the people at the, you know, in the national park. And then you come up with a conclusion. Vacation can not only be a great break from our day-to-day life. If done right, you can see the world while gaining knowledge and making new friends. A nice conclusion. Now, I didn't have to write out and memorize all that. I knew exactly where I was going on those 3 points. See something new, learn something new, meet somebody new. Yosemite, New Orleans, Lake Superior. I got my speech done. Piece of cake. Now, here's what happens. The more you get off your notes, the more you learn to think and talk to the audience, the easier it gets. I like to say that speaking is like a muscle. And learning to speak without notes is like a muscle. It's usually weak in the beginning. The more we exercise it, the stronger it gets, the more we can get off notes. That's the tip for this week. Hope you found it interesting and helpful, and I will see you next week.